Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the fourth research talk of our 2022 BMRC Fellows Presentation Series. I am Allison Sutton, the Program Manager with the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. For those of you who are joining us today and may not be familiar with us, the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, or as we call it, the BMRC, is a Chicago-based membership association of libraries, museums, universities, community arts organizations, and other archival institutions, large and small. The BMRC's mission is to connect all who seek to document, share, understand, and preserve Black experiences. So in my role with the consortium, I oversee two of our primary educational initiatives. One of them is the Summer Short-Term Fellowship Program, which over the years has attracted scholars, writers, artists from all over the country and other parts of the world. Since 2009, we have hosted more than 100 fellows each summer for a 1-month residency here in Chicago, which allows them to conduct research and in their area of focus. And after their time conducting research and digging through the archives, it's customary that they share their work with us in a presentation. So today, we will hear from one of the 7 2022 fellows, Daniel Candee. Daniel recently completed his his master's thesis at the University of Chicago, where he is specializing in the history of Black engagement with the Communist Party USA and the Communist International during the interwar period, particularly. A former summer fellow with the Schomburg Center and committed student activist, Daniel is excited to help broaden knowledge of Chicago's Red and Black past. Daniel, I will stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours, and you may begin when you're ready.
Wonderful. It's nice to see you here. I'm going to share my screen in just a sec and get us all set. All right. Can everyone see my screen? All right. I think so. So welcome, everyone. Today, I will be presenting my summer project for the BMRC, From the Front Door to the Factory Floor, Triumphs and Tribulations of Black Autonomy in the Interwar Illinois Communist Party. Before I start, I wanted to give a brief content warning. The following presentation relates to sensitive topics regarding race and class during the Native American race relations. I'm going to be talking about subjects like police violence, lynching, and other expressions of anti-Black racism. I'm a white scholar of African American and Black diasporic studies, and so I recognize my own privilege, and I'm always willing to listen to any criticisms of how I handle this material. The descriptors African American and Black have been used with care, specifically to describe Americans of African descent on one hand, and Black peoples more generally on the other. The older term Negro will also be used, but only in quotes from the period or in the reading of the name of an organization with that word in the title. There's also an anti-Black racial slur and a quote from the period included. It was originally printed in full in Harry Haywood's autobiography, Black Bolshevik, but I have decided to place an asterisk over one of its letters. And when reading the quote, I will not use the term. So let's begin. So since it split with the Socialist Party in 1919, the Communist Party of the United States of America, CPUSA, had failed to organize a substantial anti-racist coalition. According to Black communist James W. Ford, in 1929, there were less than 50 Black CPUSA members. A large amount of those members would not have been African American. Many would have been Afro-Caribbean holdovers from the African Blood Brotherhood, a left-wing Black nationalist organization which merged with the CPUSA in the early 1920s. And this, plus the party's nearly obsessive focus on foreign policy and opaque sloganeering, led many African Americans to see the Communist Party as an odd cult rather than an ally in the anti-racist struggle. But our story begins with the American Negro Labor Congress in Chicago, Illinois in 1925. The American Negro Labor Congress, or the ANLC, was the first substantial effort by the Communist Party to organize African American workers and its first meeting began very poorly. A Russian ballet troupe, rather than any African-American artists, attempted to entertain the delegates. And its organizer, Lovett Fort Whiteman, one of the first African-American communists, was dressed as a black Cossack for the meeting with a big felt Russian hat and a greatcoat. Things quickly went from awkward to disastrous, as remembered by Black communist Terry Haywood. A young blonde woman in the ballet had been shocked by the complexion of most of the audience, which she apparently expected to be of a different hue. Loudly, in a broad Texas accent, she exclaimed, "I'm not going to dance for these N-words." Somebody shouted, "Throw the cracker bitches out," and the Russian dance group hurriedly left the hall. This incident is a dramatic one, but it is indicative of the problems facing the Communist Party in organizing with African Americans. The efforts of the CPUSA's Chicago branch's Negro Committee, led by Lydia Bidell, a white woman, were not much more effective. One of the main efforts of the Negro Committee was to campaign for Communist Party candidates on the South Side for the South Side's congressional district seats. To the party's credit, they ran 2 African-American candidates in 1928 for the South Side congressional district and the at-large congressional seat. Elizabeth and Edward Doty, both working class Black communists. Over here is a photo of Elizabeth Doty that I found at the Chicago Communist Party records at the University of Chicago's library. However, this campaign did not go well either. Campaign materials were distributed that focused more on foreign policy than bread and butter issues. Pamphlets such as, well, creatively titled pamphlets such as "Why Every Negro Should Vote Communist" talked more about the danger of imperialist war than local direct issues affecting African Americans on the South Side. And there was widespread hostility from Black civil society for reasons that will become obvious in a moment. The problem the Communist Party had wasn't policy. The Communist Party was the only national majority white party in the United States which supported immediate racial equality. Its issues were internal and cultural. It refused to engage with Black cultural institutions, consistently criticizing even liberal or left-wing Black churches at this point. Opaque, brutal factional infighting alienated new members of all races, and it failed to face what it called euphemistically white chauvinism within the party. For instance, in Pittsburgh, the local CPUSA branch almost split over allowing Black members in. And Melissa could talk a little bit about after this presentation about the problems that the St. Louis CP had. They also were completely unable to cooperate with more moderate or popular Black left-wing organizations. In fact, infighting with other Black left-wing organizations had gotten so bad that the Communist Party and the ANLC accused A. Philip Randolph, a Black socialist, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, of selling out to the racist American Federation of Labor higher-ups. He responded in one of my favorite quotes from the 1920s, calling the accusations the sorriest nonsense and silliest Tommy rot, which could only emanate from crack-brained fanatics or low-grade morons. However, not every one of the Communist Party's efforts were so backwards at the time, but we do have a final piece of evidence about their efforts on the South Side during their election efforts in 1928. And it's one of my favorite pieces that I found at the BMRC over the summer. It's a letter from one Lydia Bidell, the leader of the South Side campaign, to B. Scalar, a communist leader in Milwaukee, asking for her progress on the campaign for the Dotys. And a couple of quotes from it illustrate the sort of deep-seated difficulties and incompetence facing the party's early efforts to aid the Black freedom struggle. Importantly, she mentions that the Negro Committee for the district has just been organized and has only had one meeting. When this letter was sent in October, that election was planned, the election they were campaigning for was planned to be held in a month. She stated that there are only 3 Negroes left in the party and none will speak, implying that several had been driven out beforehand, seeing that she said left in the party. And she said, we are planning 2 more special Negro leaflets, one on the war danger and one on the inadequacy of parliamentary activity alone. The problem with both of these is she mentions the inadequacy of parliamentary activity alone when the person that Edward Doty was running against in the South Side was Oscar DePriest, who would end up becoming the first African-American in Congress since the redemption of the South. it was the first African-American in Congress in 20 years. And so many African-Americans in the South Side saw the communists as splitting the vote and endangering the Republican seat in the area and making it possible for the Democrats to win. She also said that I have been putting up a long fight to make one of the Negroes take responsibility for some of the secretarial work of the committee and have succeeded only insofar as electing a Negro secretary. So she attempts to sort of pawn off responsibility for the poor performance of the campaign on the party's few Black members. But as I stated earlier, not everything was so dire. In 1928, the Trade Union Unity League, the communist alternative to the AFL, was explicitly integrated and anti-racist. And its parent organization, the Profintern, or the Red International of Trade Unions, took, as Mark Solomon put it, the strikingly advanced view that African-American workers should be promoted to general leadership and direction of all workers' struggles, Black and white. Elsewhere, the tool organized African-American miners and laundry workers, while in Chicago, their main efforts were through organizations known as the Unemployed Councils. The majority of the delegates to the Unemployed Council's founding convention in 1930 came from the tool, and it would be the Unemployed Councils that would most dramatically fuse the Communist Party and Chicago's Black community. Although the tool had already begun to create this fusion in other cities. For instance, in New York City in 1929, a strike of garment workers organized with the Needle Trade Workers Industrial Union won all of its demands for higher pay and an 8-hour day, but were told that the agreement would apply to everyone but one Black employee. The Needle Trades Worker Industrial Union went back on strike until she was given the same benefits as the white employees. There was a sort of shift in 1931 where anti-racist behaviors, actions, and strategies that had previously been limited to the tool spread out into wider practice among majority white left-wing organizations. This would later affect the Socialist Party, but began with the Communist Party. In 1931, the Great Depression was hitting Chicago hard, and none were more affected than its African-American community. Already saddled with exorbitantly high rents and low quality housing in the Black Belt region of the city, African Americans were the last hired and the first fired, and found it difficult to make their way onto relief rolls. The tool's unemployed councils stepped up to the challenge, and on August 3rd, 1931, the unemployed councils confronted the CPD to prevent the eviction of a 72-year-old African American woman named Diana Gross. Black CP organizer Abe Gray was killed in the resulting scuffle by the CPD, as were 2 other African-American protesters. This incident, combined with the ongoing nationwide debate on the fate of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 African-American teenagers who were sentenced to death after being falsely accused of raping a white woman in Alabama, led to the widespread realignment of African-American intellectuals. W.E.B. Du Bois, once a critic of the party, defended its actions, and the Socialist Party and A. Philip Randolph followed at the CP's heels. This shift also occurred nationally. Although many accounts of this period, including those of George Padmore and Harry Haywood, placed the emphasis on the change in the Comintern's policy towards self-determination in the Black Belt on its 6th Congress in 1928, this decision to embrace self-determination both was not the only resolution passed at the 6th Congress and did not directly relate to the struggles of African Americans in the industrial North. In the North, a series of concrete changes took place, exemplified first in the Robert Robinson and August Yochanan trials, one of which occurred in Moscow and the other in New York City. Robert Robinson was an African-American specialist and a factory worker in Detroit. He had lived in Chicago for several years beforehand, who was laid off during the Great Depression. He was hired by the Soviet Union to participate in the building of a tractor factory in Stalingrad and was assaulted by several of his white co-workers. The Soviets put those white co-workers on trial in front of a tribune of international workers and broadcasted the proceedings across the Union and expelled those white American workers from the Soviet Union. This paved the way for the later Yochanan trial in New York City, where Finnish communist August Yochanan was put on trial for racial chauvinism by the party and expelled. The party was cleaning up the racists within its ranks, and many African Americans were starting to notice. Integrated social events became the norm within party circles, and Dempsey Travis, who grew up on in the South Side's Black Belt during the period, recalls being impressed by the CP's commitment to Black and white social relationships. As a child, this led Travis to believe that any white person that he saw talking to a Black person must be a communist. As the 1930s moved into its second period, the Communist Party shifted to a strategy known as the Popular Front. This is often described as a clean break with the radicalism of the previous third period, which lasted from 1928 to 1933. But the truth is significantly more complicated. As I mentioned earlier, in 1928, the Communist Party issued a new series, the Comintern issued a new series of diktats to the communist parties across the world, relating to the relationship between Black people and international revolution. In these 1928 diktats, one of the orders was for the various communist organizations to stop working with the moderate wing of other left-wing organizations. For instance, in Germany, the communists stopped working with the Social Democrats. Interestingly enough, a small exception was carved out for organizing among African Americans. And united front tactics were encouraged for African American communists to attempt to infiltrate the Urban League and A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This allowed for earlier connections between Black radical communists and other Black radicals that weren't more widely felt between the communist left and the broader moderate left in the 30s until this Popular Front period. Interestingly enough, several important organizations were formed in the years prior to the Popular Front, including the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, which organized African Americans and Black workers across the world, and to which the aforementioned Needle Trades Industrial Union sent representatives, and the League for the Struggle of Negro Rights. The League for the Struggle of Negro Rights was one of the earliest civil rights organizations besides actually it adopted it before the NAACP, calling for mass civil disobedience against Jim Crow. It eventually joined into a wider organization during the Popular Front called the National Negro Congress, which held its first meeting in Chicago in 1936. The National Negro Congress was indicative of this Popular Front period, as A. Philip Randolph and other heavy critics of the Communist Party fell in with it, as the Communist Party had become so influential among African Americans in the North at this point that it was able to really bring its strength to bear across the country. Interestingly enough, the workers and organizers who were previously engaged in the Trade Union Unity League, or the TUL, eventually merged into the left wing of the CIO unions during this Popular Front period, many of them helping to found three racially progressive unions: the United Farm Equipment Workers Union, United Electrical Workers Union, and the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee. All three of these unions were integrated unions, where beforehand the AFL had maintained a strict segregationist policy in the majority of its locals. My work with BMRC Archives has looked mainly at Victoria Starr, who is an organizer with the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee. In 1939, the Works Project Administration sent a woman by the name of Betty Burke to interview those who had participated in the founding of the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee. She interviewed Victoria Kramer, which is the name that Victoria Starr was going under at the time, mainly because Starr was a notorious union organizer and a member of the Youth Communist League who had been blacklisted by almost every single major industry on the south side of Chicago. And she had to move from workplace to workplace in the South Side, staying one step ahead of the employer's blacklist. And she organized unions which included Irishmen, Poles, Italians, and African Americans on equal footing. Interestingly enough, a great amount of the sources that I've been able to find for this project came from white women involved with the Communist Party talking about Black issues. And we've mainly seen through this presentation Black communists through the eyes of their white counterparts. However, tucked away in Starr's papers are an interview with Jim Kroll, also held by Betty Burke, an African-American packing house worker, about his thoughts on the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee. And Kroll's testimony is interesting for a variety of reasons, although one quote really stuck out to me as exemplifying this transition from the American Negro Labor Congress to more effective organizing tactics that the Communist Party came across in the 30s. Kroll said, "I don't care if the union doesn't do another lick of work raising our pay or settling grievances about anything. I'll always believe they've done the most beautiful thing in the world, getting everybody who works in the yards together and breaking up the hate and bad feelings that used to be held against the Negro. We are all doing our work now. I have nothing but good to say about the CIO." So things had come a long way from the American Negro Labor Congress. Moving on, I hope to continue this research in the future. There is kind of a large gap in the scholarship about this shift in the Communist Party's efforts during the 30s and the early 40s, as the papers, as Ismail Flory, the Communist Party leader on the South Side during the second half of the 30s and most of the 1940s, and the leader of the National Negro Congress in Chicago's papers have not yet been digitized. Interestingly enough, he was also rumored to have been involved in an operation called the Second Underground Railroad that Harry Haywood talks about in his autobiography, which took African-American communists from the South and throughout the United States, smuggled them into Canada through cities in the Midwest, and got them to the Soviet Union under false pretenses. Flory is very interesting because he's one of the most powerful Communist Party organizers in the Midwest, and access to his papers would allow for more research on this interesting and understudied period in African-American history. Finally, I'd like to do some acknowledgements. I want to thank the Black Metropolis Research Consortium and Allison Sutton in particular for her help with this project, as well as the wonderful librarians at the Newberry and the UChicago Library Special Collections. I'd also like to thank Dr. Ford, my discussion, for leading the way on the topic of Midwest communism, and all the scholars from Haywood to Padmore to Robin Kelly and Cedric Robinson who have inspired me to write on this topic. I realized that for part of that I talked a bit too fast, and for part of that I talked a bit too slow. So now I will go to Q&A where I'm a bit more comfortable. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. No worries. I think we followed along pretty well. Lots of great, rich content. So we have invited, as Daniel has mentioned, Melissa Ford, who is a 2013 BMRC fellow, to serve as our facilitator, discussing for the Q&A. And Melissa is also an associate professor of history at Slippery Rock University. Her first book, A Brick and a Bible, Black Women's Radical Activism in the Midwest During the Great Depression, was published just recently in spring 2022 with Southern Illinois University Press. An entire chapter is devoted to her research done with the BMRC. Yay! She is a social historian who has a PhD in American Studies from St. Louis University, and her work focuses on African American history, women and gender studies, radicalism, labor studies, American communism, and Midwestern studies. Welcome, Melissa. We're glad to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. It's always fun to get back and remember my good times with the BMRC.
Great.
Back in my day, though, we had 2 months to spend with our fellows, and that's why I was able to write an entire chapter about Chicago. So thank you so much. And Daniel, I want to thank you so much for your presentation and your kind words. I am very eager to get into a conversation about this work, and very excited to see your knowledge and kind of delve into your process, your methodology, and how the BMRC has really facilitated that. Mm-hmm. I do want to mention, though, chat is open. If you have any questions, we can take those questions as they come. I did see something about the Communist Party in St. Louis. That's my jam. So we'll let Daniel have his say, and then if we have time, maybe I'll talk more about that. But Daniel, if it's okay, we'll just kind of jump right into questions I had prepared.
Yeah, sure.
I think as someone who, at least for myself, as someone who does Midwestern studies, the first question you get is always why? Mm-hmm. Why the Midwest? And when you talk about radicalism in the Midwest, especially in places that are, you know, not expected, let's just say maybe like Chicago, you get the question, why Chicago? Why the Midwest? And specifically for you, what do you think this location, this regionality of the Midwest and Chicago can tell us about American communism and African Americans in the 1930s that, you know, New York can't? That the South can't. I mean, the big academic studies that have been done about African Americans and the Communist Party during this time focus on Harlem and the South, mostly Alabama, Robin Kelly's genre-defined book. So why the Midwest? Why Chicago? Why does this matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm honestly, the reason that I want to focus on the Midwest is because so much focus has been put on New York and on the South. Interestingly enough, if you look at New York, a lot of these early radicals are not actually African Americans. A lot of them are Afro-Caribbean radicals, are the earliest sort of members of the Communist Party who were Black were mainly part of the African Blood Brotherhood, and a lot of them were from the English-speaking West Indies. If we want to talk about a sort of specifically American radicalism, something that I think is really interesting about Chicago is that it is the birthplace of American left-wing radicalism. It is where the Haymarket Affair happened. It was where the Communist Party was originally founded. It is the sort of center of the industrial Midwest, which was a lot more politically powerful in the United States then than it is now. And its story is incredibly important if we're looking at the story of radicalism in the United States, especially places like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Louisville, Chicago. Those places are those kind of cities are where a lot of Americans lived, and where, more importantly, a lot of African-American workers were first proletarianized, were first taken from being sharecroppers in the South to being workers in the North during the Great Migration. And so as workers, their experiences are really, and of course that happened in Harlem as well, but this sort of determined focus on Harlem because of its cultural scene to the detriment of the Midwest, I think has not been helpful in getting a more complete picture of Black radicalism. And that's why I'm kind of focusing on the Midwest and Chicago in particular, because of its really firm connections to the South, the sheer amount of Southern Black people who came to Chicago during the Great Migration. So.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I do want to give a little context for those of you who are not familiar with kind of Midwestern history. It's literally wasn't a thing until about 10 years ago. The Midwestern History Association was only formed like 7 years ago. Nobody talked about Midwestern history as a thing. And so to kind of claim it as a genre, to say that, oh, this is a discipline, this is something that can be a methodology, a lens for looking at American radicalism is relatively new. And even as you're talking about Chicago outside of, compared to Harlem and the cultural expressions, like Chicago had its own cultural renaissance. And it's only again recently, within the past 20 years, academics have been talking about Chicago's renaissance because it's so easy to get swept under the rug in light of the more famous and popular things going on in the East. And so thanks, I just want to establish that this is really important work you are doing. And perhaps later we can talk about like the implications for the present, especially when we're seeing, this Black radicalism play out today with Black Lives Matter. We're talking Ferguson, we're talking Minneapolis. These are Midwestern cities that this doesn't just erupt out of anywhere, right, or nowhere. It's drawing on this tradition that you're talking about and a lot of other people are beginning to focus on. So then I do want to talk a little bit specifically more about your research. I first love and / hate the story of the first meeting for the African-American focused section of the Communist Party in Chicago. That story of the Russian ballet dancers, it just kind of hits the nail on the head of how out of touch the Communist Party was with Black Chicagoans in the early or mid-20s. Mm-hmm. But by the late 1930s, we have seen such a transformation. And I'm wondering how you saw that played out on the ground. Yeah. Because so often with communism, we get caught up in the theory, what's happening and the theoretical, what are the pamphlets saying? But how did the personal interactions between the Communist Party and Chicago's African-American population, how did that affect this transformation you talk about?
Yeah, so I think it's important to like, there are like two categories of interaction here. I think there is almost like a going to the people style attempt in the 1920s where these organizers that aren't used to the cultural context of the Black Belt, be they either white communists or Black communists that have kind of been so absorbed by communism as like a life world that they aren't able to talk to normal African-American workers, go into the South Side and attempt to proselytize almost. They don't really lean into the strengths of working class movements, which is their ability to win concrete concessions at the workplace, their ability to sort of merge their efforts with the working class cultures of what already exists. And so what you see is from the 20s, and it's in the title, it's like from the front door to the factory floor. It goes from these communists knocking on your front door being like, will you vote for this candidate? Will you support our anti-imperialist struggle against the US government, to the factory floor where these communists are at your workplace, winning you consistent wage increases, winning you better healthcare conditions, like winning you better conditions. And then importantly, there's also the social context. So African-American, the Communist Party, like I talked about with the Jokinen trial, really, there was a thorough growing attempt to remove racists from positions of power and to remove racial chauvinism from within the party. And that paid dividends as the party started organizing. Like the only place you could go to an integrated dance in Chicago, or one of the very few places you could go to an integrated dance in Chicago in the early 1930s and the late 1920s, were the Communist Party dances that they held at a lot of their major facilities across Chicago. And those facilitated interracial relationships. They facilitated dialogue between the white and Black working classes. And importantly, there was a section from the last quote about the African-American worker with the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee that I forgot to include, where he talked about how the Communist Party and the CIO provided interpreters to the various factories on the South Side to help translate between English and the various languages of the immigrants who were working alongside these factory workers. And so the Communist Party went from this sort of outside force from the working class communities to being so integrated in it that it helped sort of to going from acting on it to being of it, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's obviously they're responding to the Great Depression. Then there's this huge need. If we're talking about Black Chicagoans, they're the first to be hit by the Great Depression. Banks in the Black Belt are the first to fail. It's no secret that African Americans were significantly disadvantaged, far more than the white workers in Chicago during the time. But there are other things going on during the Great Depression, right? Other kind of huge moments, watershed moments. And you talked about this before, and it's kind of iconic in Chicago's history, but 1931 riots, right? This huge moment of violence and escalation of police violence against protesters. So how does the Communist Party kind of respond to that? And how does that help bring these Black voices and Black actors into the party?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the Communist Party, I think one important thing is there's sort of two things they do in the early 30s across the country that really sort of win them supporters among the Black community. They join kind of like a thing I would like to call like the defense tradition, which is a tradition both of legal defense, and that's talked about the most, which is the International Labor Defense, Scottsboro Boys, that kind of stuff, where they would defend what they called class war prisoners. They provide pro bono legal counsel, take things up to the Supreme Court. But that is kind of the most like sort of dramatic and well remembered. But they also, the defense tradition, as in like physically defending African-American people from eviction, physically, like there were multiple times where there were like nearly bread riots in major cities where communists were calling for like looting of grocery stores. Like there was an actual sort of on the ground radicalizing factor where it was less, you know, like we talk about how we kind of get lost in the theory, but it was just like, people need things, we're going to get them those things. People need to not be thrown out onto the street by their landlords. We're not going to let them get thrown out onto the street by their landlords. And doing those sort of things does a million times more to sort of to bring the working class into your political coalition than sort of going to them and talking about the need to defend the Soviet Union from, you know, like imperialism, because these workers don't live in the Soviet Union. So I think that's kind of in broad strokes what changed there, and why that changed is because it's a virtuous cycle. The more that you engage with the Black working class as it exists, the more the Black working class as it exists joins the Communist Party and is able to better speak to other Black workers. And so the Communist Party, through these efforts, because even the American Negro Labor Congress, which was by all accounts a disaster from beginning to end, also brought in James W. Ford, who went to the Comintern and said, hey, there's only 50 Black people in the whole party, we should do something about this, and brought in George Padmore, who organized the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, which linked Black workers across the world for the first time within the Comintern. So.
Yeah, I think that moment you're talking about of responding to the moment, that those bread and butter issues, it was a real, I mean, it's not necessarily a stroke of genius by the communists, but it was just kind of a duh, this makes sense type of thing. And the evictions are play such a huge role in that. And Chicago and other industrial cities in the Midwest really saw their fair share of, again, mostly or disproportionately African Americans forced from their homes. And in Chicago, like St. Louis, Cleveland, Detroit, the communists were the most active. And so there's this one story, I don't know if you came across it, but it was said that whenever a family was facing eviction, whenever a Black family was facing eviction, the mother would say, run quick and get the Reds. As like, oh no, we're facing eviction, go get the communists. They're the ones that will help. And in often case, that was their only option.
Yeah, and I think it's just interesting because like these are, I think these are really pioneering like links between working class people of different races. Like I am always like kind of just floored by that quote that like, I forgot his name that I talked about in the presentation, where he thought that like growing up in the South Side in the Black Belt, like the only time when he saw white people talking to Black people, he was like, okay, that guy's a communist then. Like that's the only explanation for what can be going on. And I think that's just interesting because we've lived in, you know, a supposedly, you know, racially egalitarian bourgeois democracy for the last 40 years. And like those sort of interactions have been normalized, but like those, the pioneers there were not, you know, bleeding heart liberals coming in to like uplift poor Black people. They were often, you know, these radical left-wing organizers whose goal was to win power for the communities that they were in. So,
right.
Yeah.
Often immigrants in first generation. Right.
Yeah.
I could talk communism with you forever, but I do think to kind of draw on your experience from the BMRC, we should talk about your process. And it looks like Marcia has a great question here about that. So I'll go ahead and read it. Daniel, you mentioned that a lot of sources on Black people in the Communist Party are authored by whites in the party or from the perspective of Afro-Caribbean party members. And you mentioned the need to have more important collections of African-American communists like Ishmael Floyd papers processed and digitized. What else do you think contributes to the lack of collections or sources authored by African-American communists? It's a great question, thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can, to provide a short answer and a long answer. Short answer is McCarthyism, and then it's white people making the archives most of the time. So like it is what the Communist Party branches choose to preserve are usually by the people who are in the party the longest, who live the longest, who have all these papers in their basement and decide to hand them over to some library or the other. And those are often white party members. And it is not to say that they are purposefully not including Black people's voices, but Black people's voices were recorded less in the first place. I think that like the sort of invisibility thing is interesting because Victoria Starr, she talks about, she was one of 3 women who helped form the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee in 36. And one of the workers interviewed about it decades later, was like, oh yeah, it was 12 guys in the back of a bar who came up with it, 12 men. And when she heard about that, she was like, yeah, but they just don't remember the women. They just filter them out of their mind. And I think white people can do the same thing for Black people in their own organizations. And that is not to say these are a lot of these people are the most committed anti-racists, you know, in like the 20th century. But even that sort of implicit bias can occasionally come through. But I think that is like an incredibly minor problem in comparison to McCarthyism, which is a lot of these people are like arrested and their papers are seized by the state, or they have to destroy their papers because they're incriminating evidence, or the ones who aren't intellectuals, who are working class people on the ground doing this organizing. Some of them, some fellow travelers might not, like there was high illiteracy rates, frankly, in a lot of areas of the North. And then there was a lot of issues with frankly, like not enough got noted down about these efforts because they were so spontaneous and so radical. It's incriminating evidence. If you say, me and my buddy went to this place and we fist fought a bunch of strike breakers outside of this factory, if you write that down anywhere, until the statute of limitations is up, you're putting yourself at risk. So I think those are kind of two main reasons why that happened.
Yeah, you're absolutely, I agree right with you there. So many times it's initials or Comrade X, and you're like, oh, I just want the name. Mm-hmm. But that's such a fascinating explanation. And I want to talk a little bit more about these archives then. And the nature in which they're changing. Because one thing we talked about earlier is that you were able to use sources in Chicago that I didn't have, because they were organized just a few years ago. And so how has the BMRC helped you in this? And like, what does this kind of consortium do for scholars like us who don't necessarily have that one source to go off from, but are trying to piece together this puzzle and hope we can get a somewhat accurate picture, because so many pieces are missing?
Yeah, so I'll say the two main things the BMRC did for me was one, first, the social connections that people at the BMRC have across the city are amazing. Like the nearly encyclopedic knowledge of where a bunch of these collections are held, of who the librarians are, of how you can get in. They provide for scholars with them an access that I think is unparalleled to these archives. For instance, like there was one thing I very vividly remember was I came to U Chicago before I was ever in the BMRC or one of their fellows. And one of the first thing I did when I was looking for doing research on my master's thesis, which also involves Black communism, was I met with Marcia, who's also affiliated with the BMRC, just like Miss Sutton. And we talked for like probably an hour and a half just about all the different resources and all the different people I should talk to, the Illinois Labor History Society, all these different organizations and places I should check out. And so by the time that I even got this fellowship, I had visited multiple BMRC affiliated places without even knowing they were BMRC affiliated, because they're just so sort of tied into study of this stuff. And then the other thing is, and to be, a bit vulgar about it, I couldn't pay the rent this summer if it weren't for the BMRC. If it weren't for the money for the fellowship, I would not be able to stay in Chicago and do the research. And so I think they also provide, frankly, financial resources to support the study of an understudied field, a field that is there's, not a lot of money to be made in studying it some of the time. So I honestly think, it is and I think, as much as I love the Schomburg and I love working with the Schomburg, Harlem history is very well studied. It's very well supported. And I think Chicago needs that level of investment and attention. And I'm glad the BMRC is doing that. So, yeah.
And this kind of goes back to our initial conversation about why Midwestern studies isn't a thing, right? Hasn't been a thing for a while. And I would argue we need, yes, the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, but we also need the St. Louis Urban History Research Consortium. We need the Cleveland Black History. We need these institutions to better preserve these histories that are so fleeting, right? That are or so rare in that national perspective.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking is I have work which starts in 15 minutes, and I was thinking I want to answer some questions from the audience if they have any. Is it okay if we transitioned over to that really quickly?
Yeah. I think Marcia's question, I guess there was just a follow-up. Oh, here you go. Allison has a question. I know you were not able to review the Flory papers at the Vivian Harsh collection, but since Flory was heavily involved in Communist Party organizing in Chicago until I think the 1980s, is there any link to him and Fred Hampton, Fred Hampton's late establishment in 1960s of the Rainbow Coalition that was pulling together active radical leftist groups of Black, Latino, and Chinese groups in Chicago? And it looks like you're ready to go on this, so.
Well, actually, I was opening my mouth because I was desperately searching my memory banks for something about it. And I'm going to be honest, this is like one of the things where I you know, as much as I like talking about this stuff, I do not know everything. I don't know, actually. It feels like there should be some. It would make sense. I honestly, I mean, it's another reason I want to look at the papers. I hope that, but I mean, it would definitely make sense that there would be a connection between, because a lot of my work has to do with, like, outside of this BMRC fellowship, has to do with the connections between the old and the new left. And a lot of the time it's like people are their like literal children are also involved in the new left. So like I studied this African-American communist writer, Harlem Renaissance writer, World War I veteran named Eugene Gordon, whose son, Eugene Gordon Jr., was in France during May 1968. And so it's like these intergenerational connections are really important. And obviously Fred Hampton and Ishmael Flory aren't related, but it would not, if he, because, you know, when I was reading about Flory, you know, one of the first things that comes up when you Google him, he hit images, is him protesting Reagan all the way late in the 80s. He's doing this his whole life. And so I would assume that these connections would remain. Although I guess there's also the possibility, like there's a lot of sectarianism and factionalism on the left. You know, Flory stays with the Communist Party. Fred Hampton tries to explore sort of like more, either more Maoist or more kind of like socialism without adjectives option that might lead to some disputes. And so it's like what's so interesting about studying this period is you can't flatten all the radicals into like sort of like one faction that's unified against, you know, hegemonic capitalist power. It's all of these different people kind of trying to organically work through what can they do to change their society. So yeah, and Flory would come to a different answer than Fred Hampton. So.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so hard to look at Communist Party records from the official party from in New York. If they claim how many members and things like that, it's like, well, no, not everyone who participated in the eviction protests or who went to the dances joined the Communist Party, but they're participating in radicalism, right? They're part of this movement, this moment of unrest in the 1930s that is protesting the capitalist conditions that led to the Great Depression and seeking to find answers to immediate problems. But because those boundaries that communism often, you know, sets up, the specific definitions, they have been left in the margins.
Yeah.
Well, I know you have to go. I do want to have one more question because this is always my favorite thing to do is what was your favorite archival find? What did you find that you're just like, with that moment in the library and light shines down on the document? What was it?
It was definitely that Vidal letter. And I wish I could have like just read it out in full because it is just kind of the most, like I was reading it and I was just kind of reminded of a lot of problems that like white majority left-wing organizations have today. But it comes with like talking about like Black issues when it comes to communism, like this sort of assumption. It was like simultaneously like I couldn't blame her because she's in an organization in the 1920s that is supporting total racial equality as a white woman, but then she's also in this organization reproducing white supremacy in ways that she's not aware of. And I think it's like that conflict. It's interesting that it's not resolved by teaching white people the right thing to do. It's resolved by Black people winning more power within these working class organizations and winning more influence within them, which is not to like flatten a class analysis into a race analysis, but to say that like the lived experiences of the Black working class is different than the white working class. And so they're Black communists, by winning power within the Communist Party, you know, by 1929, it's not a coincidence that in 1929, there are, for the first time, are like 8 members of the Central Committee of the CPUSA that are Black. John Hall, Otto Hugheswood, I think Cyril Briggs, people like that, who, and then a couple of years later, a Black engagement with the Communist Party spikes. And it's because they have a better understanding of Black conditions than a lot of white communists do. But also white communists, through the organization becoming more and more interracial and becoming more and more integrated, are able to learn more and more about their Black comrades, are able to interact with Black communities more effectively. And I think there was an anecdote that you told me about that was, it was when Oscar de Priest tried to talk to those would you mind telling me It's about
okay, I'll share. This was my archival find when the sun came down, and there's a strike in 1933 that was led by Black women with the support of the Communist Party. And Oscar de Priest, the famous Black councilman on the South Side, was chosen as one of the arbiters. So he goes into this meeting hall with all the Black women strikers who are in the audience, and he starts talking, and he represents this liberal politics, right? He represents an established Black middle class that didn't have the answers to the Great Depression, that had been telling these women to, stay the course. And so the women started booing him and started jeering him. And a white communist leader walks out on stage, and they start chanting for the white communist leader, this Jewish guy from New York. They're like, yeah, we want him, we want him. And then they all got up and left with the white communist. It's because de Priest was so out of touch with these needs of these Black working class women. So yeah, that was my favorite find. And just while I'm touting my own work, my work about St. Louis can be seen in my book, A Brick and a Bible. And there's so many parallels between, St. Louis and Chicago. I also look at Detroit and Cleveland. There's so many parallels, but Chicago is in itself unique. And that's why I think it's so important to keep kind of doing this work. And so, Daniel, we will, I think, wrap it up. Any last words?
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say is, and I do have to be at work in 5 minutes, but the final thing I will say is, I saw that Lowell Denny asked in the chat, like, what drew me to this work, and I'm just gonna be very clear, like, I grew up in the South. I grew up in Louisville, kind of like that weird sort of like midpoint between the Midwest and the South. And there I sort of went to, Louisville had this huge fight in the 70s about busing. And so it was one of the few places where busing won. And so I grew up going to very sort of like integrated high schools. And when I was going to these very integrated high schools, that just kind of seemed completely normal to me, like growing up exposed to Black culture. But what really got to me and what got me interested in this work and in leftism in general is I'm 22, and in 2017, when those Charlottesville riots occurred with the white supremacists marching past Black churches with tiki torches and stuff, the only people I saw opposing them were waving red flags. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Why are the communists doing this? And the more I looked into it, and the more I read about leftism, I quickly realized that, like Marx talks all about how the birth of capitalism is because of these industrial workers in England, but, where is the cotton that they're processing coming from? Who's growing that? This is Black history, is working class history, and finding the connections between the two has really always been incredibly interesting to me. And I really do have to thank especially Dr. Andrew Rosa at WKU, who's studying Sinclair Drake, a Black radical here, for like inspiring me to continue on this. And any other questions you all have, I see that Allison
I'm a step ahead of you. Yes, there may be other questions people think of later. And I just want to, because we're right at time, thank you, Daniel, for sharing your research with us today, and you, Melissa, for facilitating the discussion and adding so richly to it. We appreciate it. And Daniel, you must keep in touch with us and let us know where your research takes you next, and what you've added, what else you're adding to this conversation.
All right. Well, I got to go to work. I really want to talk to everybody.
Thank you very much. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.